Hi, I'm Brittney Gallagher, witnessing the phases of the moon with.
Phil Libin. Welcome to the last episode of season 1 of Degrees of Freedom, making the out of office world.
Yeah, where we dive into the evolving ecosystem that is distributed work. And in this episode, we're focusing on the role of the company and how it has changed, and as well as a bit of a look back on what we've talked about over the course of the season. One interesting story that has come up out of NPR recently around the economic downturn is about how employees are willing to take pay cuts to actually work distributedly. And they actually found in a new study when they surveyed more than 500 US companies, asking them how they're using remote work, a lot were saying, well, we're trying not to give people raises right now because the economy is not so great, but we're trying to give them perks. And this is one of the main perks that we're seeing. I think this is a really interesting evolution because when we started this series, the economy was looking a little bit better than it's looking now, right? And so people, the employees were still fighting to be distributed, but now they're still wanting to stay distributed, but instead they'll take a pay cut to stay that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think this shows the durability of distributed work and asynchronous work. I think it's probably short-sighted to think of it as a perk. I don't think companies shouldn't do this as a perk. They should do it because they can be much more productive. So this shouldn't be an either or. It shouldn't be more money or distributed work. It should be both. You should be getting paid more, and you should have the freedom to work where or how you want to work. But I think this is just it's a symptom that once you've worked in a distributed way, if you were fortunate enough to be in a place that knows how to set that up, it's just so much better than being forced to work in real time in an office with commuting and all that kind of stuff that you're never going to go back. So yes, hopefully within a few years we'll kind of see this evolution and see this not so much as a perk, but as the default way of working.
One thing we're going to touch on in this episode is what the role of the company is and how it's changing. So Joanna Miller is back with Phil to talk a bit about that. So here's Phil and Joanna.
Reid Hoffman wrote this book a few years ago called The Alliance, where his main point is he thought that the fundamental agreement, the contract between the company and the employees had become kind of dishonest, because it was talked about on both sides as if it were this lifelong relationship, like a multi-decade relationship, and we're a family. But everyone knew that wasn't true. In fact, if you actually looked at the employment language, it all says in giant caps, employment at will and all that stuff. And everyone knows that, especially in the tech industry, people are leaving every 18 months or so. And so you had the reality of people churning jobs all the time, but there was this fiction that still permeates that as if this were a lifelong relationship. And that fundamental dishonesty in his hypothesis leads to all sorts of problems where, well, there's no good time to quit because you were supposed to pretend that you were in it for life and that kind of stuff. And so Reid suggests reframing it as you've said projects. He uses the word tour of duty to kind of say, all right, well, here's what I'm going to be working on for the next tour of duty, which could be 6 months or it could be 2 years. And here's what I want to accomplish, and here's how I want to be better for my next tour of duty, and kind of do it in these medium-sized modules to make that fair. Which actually strikes me as sort of the way the Asana product works. You follow that philosophy to let people actually deal with complex things. How do you think about your employees, your team members, projects or tours of duty? What is that right level of granularity to optimize for?
Yeah, the word that I like to use is that we're a community, and each community has values that the members of the community are agreeing to be in service of and to amplify being part of that community. So at Asana, some of those values include mindfulness. Everything that we do with each other and for the business should be done with intentionality. And if we feel like we're rushing, we should pause for a moment and say, what is this in service of? How is it in service of our mission and customers? And if it isn't, can we take a moment here to get back on track or to understand, why this thing that we're doing may not be directly in service? Another value that underpins the community is rejecting false trade-offs. So it's very easy to get into a binary mindset of it's either this or that. It's either this one solution or that or another solution. And I think one of the practices that has really served people, especially when they think about career, is that it's not just going up the ladder or moving laterally or working on one project or program. There can be many ways in which I can be of service to the community of Asana. Many of the principles of tours of duty exist when we talk about career development. So one of the things I like to talk about with employees is what's the job that you're doing right now? Is it to get you exposure to certain types of customers? Like maybe you worked with small business customers and you really want to get exposed to enterprise deals and the needs of enterprise customers. So maybe the purpose or the job of being on this team on this project right now is to do that. You've done all the other things, components or competencies that make you successful at that job, but really getting exposure to this different client base is going to help you get the experience that you would like. For other people, it may be management and leading a large team. So the job of your job is maybe not to be an expert on marketing for product marketing. You have the skills for that, but it's really to understand what it is to manage and scale a team that's really serving a global base. And once you've done that, you should have a frank discussion with your manager and the people who are helping you in your career to say, okay, like I've checked those jobs, I've had those experiences. What else might I be able to do in service of myself, how I want to grow, and also how the company wants to grow. The last thing I want to say is around agency. I feel like a lot of times when I'm talking to individuals, they're like, I don't know if my manager is going to allow me to, pursue this opportunity, or I want to quit, but I'm afraid that my employer is going to feel like I let them down or some way didn't honor, what I agreed to.
Right.
And I think that it's really important for companies to say, as long as you are doing what we've asked you to do, when the time comes to leave or to move on or shift in some way, we can have an honest conversation about that.
Yeah.
I think there is so much information asymmetry between employers and employees, where an employer has all the information oftentimes, and the employee is always guessing and hedging if asking for this or that is going to impact how people perceive me, my path to advancement, in a way that's actually going to damage my livelihood. And I think trusting that you can have those open and honest conversations, and that someone choosing what's right for them and their family or their personal life at that time isn't a, diss to the company, would go a long way in terms of trust between these two parties or entities.
Yeah, our policy is and it's something that we really try to make it stick with all the managers is as a manager, I succeed if your next tour of duty, if your next job is much more epic than your current one. If your next job is something that's so much better than your current one, and you were able to get it because of what you learned in the current job, then that is my biggest success as a manager. And hopefully that next job is with our company, and that's great. But oftentimes it's not with our company, and that's also great.
Yes.
And anytime anyone leaves to pursue a better job, we have won as managers. The only failure as a manager is if one of my employees leaves to take a job that's worse than their current job, because then they're obviously leaving because I'm a bad manager.
Yeah, and something else that was unsatisfying.
Exactly, yeah, all sorts of reasons, but that's a failure case. Somebody leaving for a better job, that is a celebration. That is fantastic, and not just like a celebration through clenched teeth. Like we feel genuinely happy. So we've started thinking about former employees more like alumni.
Yes.
Because I think colleges do a good job with this, right? Like you leave the college and the college is like, oh, I can't believe you left. It's like, well, yeah, that's what you're supposed to do. And most employees aren't staying for 4 years. So like, you're in college for longer. So why do we have this expectation? I think you've put that really well.
On this piece about alums, we think of we use that term as well. And I think of your alumni are your best marketing tool.
Yeah.
Even if someone's decided to move on, you want that person to say, I loved working at All Turtles. I loved working at Asana. You should work there. there's a really interesting project or really supportive people that are going to help you grow.
I think that's right. But I really like what you're saying about agency. I think that is kind of the central thing, and the central thing that we're really hoping to change by giving more people the opportunity to be out of office, to live wherever they work, wherever they want, and work wherever they feel like they can have the best impact, and really just give as many people as possible that extra agency, so that people don't have to be passive bystanders to the world. They're not just there and the world happens to them. They can affect it. They can make it possible.
It took me a long time to shift out of this thinking of myself through the lens of my profession. But when I did, the thing that helped me find direction are the values that I hold, and thinking about how, empathy, collaborative learning, building community, and recognizing a sense of possibility in different situations were things that I hold regardless of what domain or context I'm in. And what I'm in service of, or using those values in service of, can change and should over time. So I like to think of it more of like a kaleidoscope. The things that are inside the kaleidoscope, they're fixed. But if you point it in different directions, something very different, beautiful can be revealed. And the same thing with your job, your skills, and what you're bringing to your career.
That's a beautiful way of thinking about it.
One thing that Joanna mentioned that was interesting, that's maybe a bit harder in a distributed company, is dealing with information asymmetry between the employer and the employee. So Phil, how do you think about this in a distributed company, and how can you focus those conversations when you aren't in the same space?
I think the thing that we've always tried to optimize for and are trying to get better at is clarity. I think sometimes companies think a little bit too much about the wrong thing. Some people will say, well, what's really important is transparency. But I actually don't think transparency in and of itself is particularly important. I think what's important is clarity. Sometimes you can have transparency. Very often you can have transparency in a way that gets in the way of clarity, where you have a lot of information without context that's maybe incomplete, that maybe isn't explained fully. People jump to their own conclusions. You can see a situation where sharing too much information actually gets in the way of people being clear about what they should do. Whereas if you focus on clarity, you have to find that right balance. Secrecy is in general also not good for clarity. Clarity is its own goal. So the way that we try to achieve clarity, and I think we're okay at it, but we really need to get much better. I think most companies need to get much better, is just to be really intentional about it. And being distributed really helps with that, because it almost forces it, right? One of the things that we kept coming back to in the season of this show is how being distributed works well, but it forces you to be more intentional about everything, because a lot of the shortcuts that we used to rely on without thinking about it when we were all in the same office don't work anymore. A lot of the little informational shortcuts of, people chatting in the break room, or, just by walking around, like, those are gone. So you need to replace them with more intentional communication. But once you've done that, you kind of realize that, well, the old shortcuts were never that good to begin with. It's not like we had perfect clarity or even pretty good clarity when we were in the office. We had all sorts of confusion and misalignment. And now we can do better. We just have to intentionally design our information hygiene to achieve as much clarity as we can.
I like that phrase, information hygiene. I don't know if I've heard that before. That's a good way of putting it.
Being a distributed team is also good for personal hygiene.
Well, or I don't know, is it good for personal hygiene?
It's good for not having to care about the
personal hygiene as much. Something I've been thinking a lot about over the course of this series is moving an existing company to being distributed, right? Like you did. Well, I guess you have an example of both. You have All Turtles, where you were in the office, everyone was together, and then you created as a distributed company. So you had kind of both that you did.
And Tammy Son from Carrot, they were all in an office together in San Francisco, and then had to go distribute it. But while doing it, grew a lot. So I think we've seen all sorts of permutations in the general, All Turtles family of companies that were born distributed, became distributed and grew a lot.
My question though to you around all this is like, what is your advice for a new startup or a new company that's planning to be fully distributed?
I think it's interesting how our thinking on this has even evolved since the beginning of this of Degrees of Freedom, right? We've been doing this show for a few months now. We did the earliest interviews were what, 6 months ago or something like that.
Yeah.
And even my own thinking about this has changed a bunch. I think the big distinction right now and going forward isn't so much in person or distributed. I think lots of companies will have combinations of both. Lots of companies will be entirely distributed. I think the distinction, the important distinction going forward, isn't even so much about in the office or distributed. It's about high trust or low trust. I think that's going to be the two categories that companies sort themselves into. Traditionally, most companies are low trust environments, meaning they don't really trust their employees. And a lot of those are where you're hearing calls for bringing people back. They say, well, if we don't, can we trust that you're working if we can't see you working? So there's a lot of like butts in seats mentality. But in low trust companies, even when they allow you to work remotely, they still don't trust you. And so you see a lot of surveillance. There was an article in the New York Times recently about kind of the rise of surveillance of white collar workers, key logging and taking screenshots and making sure that people really are working. How many minutes a day are you working and how many breaks are you taking and that kind of stuff. And those are all symptoms of low trust environments. And I can kind of understand them. I can kind of understand if you're traditionally a low trust place and you're trying to operate remotely or fully distributed, how would you have confidence if people are getting anything done? You have to spy on them. And then I think there's high trust environments, high trust companies, which say, well, we trust you to get work done, to be motivated to get the work done, to figure out how to get the work done. And we're not going to need to see you every day, and we're not going to force people to do anything. We're going to try to give people the tools to be productive because we assume that the people who work with us want to be productive. And we're going to extend the time horizon in which we evaluate people from, how many minutes did you take on break today, or how many seconds of mouse wiggling did you have today, or how many keys did you push, to how much did you get done this month? How big of an impact on the company's goals did you have this quarter? Yeah. That kind of stuff. And so I guess my advice is to try to be clear about, are you trying to be a high confidence, a high trust company, or are you okay being a low trust company? And both are valid answers. I think there's a lot of companies that probably have to be low trust because of the industries they're in or the types of people they have. But if you're trying to be high trust, and we've talked about trust a lot on this show, then you just have to do the work to set up the management practices to actually evaluate people's impact over the span of months, and not try to measure things in shorter time intervals, and be intentional about it. And that's what we're trying to do, and we're trying to get good at it. And I think it's working pretty well. I think we'll be even better at it, a year from now than we were in the past year. But we're coming about this very clearly with this understanding that what we're trying to build is a high trust environment where, by definition, some people are going to break that trust, and we just have to get good at evaluating people's overall impact over a long period of time, distancing ourselves from people who turn out not to be trustworthy, but really leaning into giving people the flexibility and the tools to get their work done in a full trust environment.
Yeah. I was reading this article recently about LARPing your job, live action role playing your job, where you're kind of just like, oh, look at this. Like, you're messaging in Slack a lot. You're like very active online. So you're kind of like, let people know that you're doing stuff, you're messaging, and that you're like embodying this like extra effort to just like prove you're doing stuff because you're remote. And I think that was a really interesting way of describing that and sort of phenomenon.
Yeah, and all of those feel like dead ends to me, right? Yeah. It feels like the real work for management has to be, can we set up goals for impact that we can actually measure over the period of a month or so?
Yeah.
And then it doesn't matter how busy people seem. Like seeming busy in person is an art that some people got really good at.
Mhm.
Seeming busy remote is a different kind of art that some people get really good at, but neither of those actually matter, right? What matters is the impact that you're having, but that's harder for management, right? It's harder for management to actually measure impact
Yeah, of
and to
course.
say what the goals are than to measure how productive you look.
Yeah.
But I think it's essential to being an effective distributed company.
Yeah.
And we'll see. There's a very good question about like, how big can you have a high trust team?
Yeah.
Like we're not that big. We're like 100 people,
Mhm.
and we I think can get to a high trust team. It's not easy, but we're getting there, and we're going to be even better at it. But can a 10,000 person company be high trust and operate like this? Maybe.
Mm.
There's certainly companies that are trying, right? Like 3M was doing interesting work on trusting their employees, even though there's thousands or tens of thousands of people. But that's going to be really interesting to see how over the next few years, high trust and low trust environments sort themselves out, and who wants to work in which different type, and what does it feel like to work in each different type of company.
And it's interesting. I'm reading Walter Isaacson's Codebreaker right now on Jennifer Doudna and the whole like CRISPR
Mhm.
thing. And in science, I feel like is a little bit different than knowledge than like traditional knowledge work, like this research science. But they actually, the original paper that caused quite the stir on Cas9, two people were here, or well, here as in San Francisco Bay Area, PST time zone, and the others were actually in Europe. And they collaborated together and would run experiments. And this is obviously a few years ago before COVID, but how they were able to actually, make what ended up winning, a Nobel Prize, like by being across the world from each other. And they had these, like a lot of what we talked about, where it's not just working out of the office. Like you do have these in-person touch points that are intentional when you're together, and it did actually work out quite well for them.
There's definitely lots of success cases of teams that have embraced this distributed and high trust philosophy that have had very high impact on the world, and it'll be great to see. It'll be great to see how different organizations sort themselves into what I think are going to be kind of the two fundamental buckets of places to work.
There have been obviously a lot of critics of the out of office world, and the most recent one was, of course, Canadian writer Malcolm Gladwell saying on the Diary of the CEO podcast that working from home isn't in workers' best interests. And Jamie Dimon, of course, of JP Morgan, says it just does not work. And a lot of workers, especially young workers, don't agree. Some want to be in the office sometimes. Others want to work from home. And really, this isn't necessarily a one size fits all. But I think the thing that we've seen throughout the series is like, this is a big deal. And this isn't going away. The pandemic catalyzed this, it was a crucible moment, as Roelof Botha said. And one thing, Phil, that you had said in our first episode, you predicted that in 10 years, it's going to go up from a couple 100 million people working distributedly to probably 2 billion. So I want to see if, that was a while ago and you still agree with that number. We've had an economic downturn a bit since then. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think what I said was, if you look back to before COVID, 3 years ago, how many people had the opportunity to choose where they wanted to live separately from where their job was and not have one affect the other.
Yeah.
And they said maybe there was like 100 or 200,000 people worldwide alive at that time that could have this choice. This was an amazing luxury that really very few people got a chance to do. And I thought that now, 3 years later, that number is probably about 200 million. Probably about 200 million people in the world have the option, can choose. Doesn't mean that they're taking advantage of it, but are in an environment where they could move to live wherever they thought they could have the best life and work wherever they thought they have the best job, and those two things aren't connected. And in a decade, I thought that it would expand to 1 or 2 billion people that would have that option, and I still believe that. I think it's a different question about how many people will actually do it. I think a lot. I think a large number, and that's going to be more backloaded, right? That's going to be like people have to realize it and then actually take the plunge. My assistant Leah, right? Recent example a few months ago. She was living in San Francisco this whole time, and she just moved to Mexico, and she loves it. right? She gets to keep her job. She makes the same amount of money that she was making before. So she's making San Francisco salary, but she's living in a beautiful town in Mexico, and has been talking about how super happy she is with that. And I think more and more people will understand that and will do it. But yeah, I think there'll be a few billion people that have the option to do it. If you figure there's about 8 billion people in the world right now, I think having a quarter of them, 25%, have the option to do that. Yeah, I absolutely believe that. And I don't think that short-term conditions like an economic downturn really slow it down. If anything, once something is this inevitable, any sharp shock in the system tends to move it further in the correct direction. Like there's nothing that's going to roll it back. Economic downturn and recession is a good example. You have an economic downturn, and sure, you have some companies and some bosses that are low trust environments saying, here's our opportunity to force people to do things because, the balance of power is swinging and now employers have more power. So yeah, a few employers are going to use this as an opportunity to force people back. But then the only people left working for those companies will be the people who can't get other jobs. And so the people that are higher skilled, that are more economically mobile, more of them will choose jobs that allow them to be distributed, which will make those companies at vast competitive advantages. So it's all a self-perpetuating and self-correcting cycle. But yeah, I'm sticking to my prediction. In 10 years, I'm guessing roughly 25% of the people will have this opportunity. And what percentage of people will take advantage of it? I mean, it's going to be harder to measure, but yeah, I think there will be hundreds of millions of people that make the move. And this will be the most significant economic shift in the world in my lifetime. So thank you again to all of our distinguished guests. Jessica Collier, my co-founder at All Turtles and currently the CEO of Spot, is going clockwise. Joanna Miller from Asana, Professor Enrique Danz, who teaches innovation at the IE Business School in Madrid. Dean Matt Waller from the University of Arkansas Walton School of Business, who gave me the opportunity to co-teach this class with him, a class where a lot of this content came from. It's a class called Important Questions in Distributed Work. Tammy Sun, the founder and CEO of Carrot Fertility. Vrolov Botha, who is the senior steward. I still think that's the coolest title of anyone in this group, the senior steward of Sequoia. And Lydia Jett from the SoftBank Vision Fund. I really enjoyed talking to everyone. And big thanks to you, to Brittney Gallagher, for being my co-host in all of this.
Yeah, and thanks to you, Phil. And also thanks to all of our other guests who joined us over the course of the series to talk about their personal experiences with distributed work. Woo! So yeah, that's it for this season of Degrees of Freedom. Everyone loves videos of fireworks, right? At least I feel like on the 4th of July, you're inundated with firework videos. So that's it for this season of Degrees of Freedom, making the out-of-office world. I'm Brittney Gallagher.
And I'm Phil Libin, and we'll see you back here for season 2, maybe. Who knows?
Hopefully, yeah. Bye.